An 8-year-old boy hasn't stopped crying since he lost his mother, and no expensive psychologist or toy can comfort him. 6 months later, the new maid's daughter finds him crying alone, and what she says leaves the millionaire completely devastated. The crying always started the same way, a low sob, almost a broken whisper, that originated deep in Leo's small chest and rose up his throat like a bubble of pain. Within moments, it would morph into a continuous wail, a sorrowful melody that echoed through the mansion's empty halls. For 6 months, ever since the scent of his mother had vanished from the sheets and her laugh had stopped bouncing off the marble walls, Leo's crying had been the estate's agonizing soundtrack. At 8 years old, he was the heir to an incalculable fortune, an estate his father, Arthur, had built with a brilliant Wall Street mind, turning a small initial capital into a sprawling investment and real estate empire. But what good was all that wealth if the only thing Leo truly wanted could not be bought, not even with all the gold in the world? That morning, Arthur entered his son's room wearing the same expression of defeat he wore every day. In his arms, he carried an enormous box wrapped in shimmering paper. Inside was the newest, highest-end gaming console on the market, a gift that cost a small fortune in dollars. He placed it at the foot of the bed, where Leo was curled up, his face stained with tears. "Look, son, this is the one you saw in the magazine. We can play it together." Arthur's voice was gentle, yet distant, as if coming from another room entirely. Leo didn't even glance at the box. His eyes, large and sorrowful, were fixed on a picture frame on the nightstand, a smiling woman with the same eyes as his, hugging him tightly. "I don't want it," he whispered, his voice choked. "I want Mom." Arthur sighed, a heavy sound of frustration and impotence. He understood cash flow, profitability, how to multiply his assets. But his son's broken heart was an indecipherable enigma. His assets filled bank vaults. His investments yielded astronomical returns. Yet he couldn't generate a single smile on the face of the person he loved most. He backed away, leaving the box untouched on the floor, a gleaming monument to his failure. In the hallway, he ran his hands through his hair, the weight of the world on his shoulders. How could he explain to a child that life simply goes on? He looked out the immense window that overlooked the perfectly manicured lawn, a green, silent space where no child ever played. The house was a palace, but also a gilded cage, suffocated by grief. Every expensive object, every piece of art seemed to mock his pain. He was a multi-millionaire who couldn't comfort his own child. As he lost himself in his dark thoughts, the sound of the doorbell startled him. Alfred, the butler, answered the door. It was the new hired staff. The high-end domestic agency had recommended the best. A plain-looking woman with calloused hands and a dignified gaze, named Rosa. Beside her, timidly clutching the hem of her simple dress, stood a dark-haired girl with curious eyes, the same age as Leo. The mother had explained she had no one to leave her with on the first day. It was temporary, just until she got settled. Arthur merely nodded, indifferent. To him, they were just more employees, invisible cogs in the machinery of his empty life. But when the heavy oak door closed, a sound reached the ears of the small visitor, a sound she knew all too well. Coming from upstairs, muffled by the distance and the luxury, was the unmistakable lament of a child who had lost everything that mattered. Lena looked up at the imposing staircase, and her small heart felt a pang of recognition, an immediate connection to the pain floating in the air. While Rosa received instructions from Alfred, the stern-faced butler, Lena remained by her side, a small ghost in a palace of silence. Her mother squeezed her shoulder with a grip that was both a warning and a plea for help. "Stay here, don't touch anything, and for God's sake, don't make a sound," Rosa whispered, her eyes pleading. For them, this job was more than a paycheck. It was the difference between making rent and facing eviction. The money they would earn here represented the stability they had so long sought. Lena nodded, her wide eyes absorbing every detail of this strange world. The floor shined so brightly it reflected her face. Stone angel statues watched her from shadowy corners, and the air had a clean, sterile scent, like a high-end gallery where everything is too expensive to touch. It was a house that held a fortune, but it didn't feel like a home. There were no scattered toys, no smell of baking pie, no overlapping voices of a family. There was only the echo of one's own footsteps, and that distant crying, which had resumed upstairs. Her mother began working in one of the vast salons, and Lena sat obediently on a small step near the kitchen, but the sound called to her. It wasn't the cry of a spoiled child or one in physical pain. It was a hollow, deep sound that seemed to come from the soul. She had heard it before, in her own small apartment, years ago, in the silence of the night, coming from her mother's room. It was the sound of profound longing. Ignoring the knot of fear in her stomach and the promise made to Rosa, Lena got up. Her bare feet made no sound on the oriental rug that covered the corridor. She followed the sadness, climbing the curved staircase as if guided by an invisible thread. Each step brought her closer to the epicenter of the house's sorrow. The crying grew clearer, more desperate. Finally, she reached a hallway with several closed doors. One was ajar. The soft light escaping the crack invited her to peek. Heart pounding, she crept closer and looked inside. The room was larger than her entire home. Expensive toys were piled in corners, untouched. An electric train set occupied an entire table, still. And on the rumpled bed was the boy. He was hugging the picture frame so tightly, his knuckles were white. His small body trembled with the force of his sobs. He wasn't just crying, he was utterly unraveling. Lena watched, not with pity, but with overwhelming empathy. She didn't see a rich boy surrounded by luxury. She saw a broken heart, an equal. She understood the language of that pain. She knew that no new toy or empty promise could fill the hole that absence leaves. She saw his loneliness, a solitude as vast as that mansion. As she watched him, paralyzed by that profound connection, the boy, in a fit of frustration and sorrow, grabbed a teddy bear beside him and flung it weakly against the opposite wall. The bear gently hit the wood and rolled onto the carpet, exiting through the door crack. It stopped exactly at Lena's bare feet. The soft sound of the toy on the rug abruptly silenced the crying. Leo lifted his head, and his tear-reddened, swollen eyes met the dark, quiet eyes of the girl standing in his doorway. The silence that settled between them was louder and more freighted with meaning than any sound that had ever filled that house. For a long moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Leo stared at the girl in the doorway, his body tense, prepared for the usual. The sugary words, the empty promises, the hesitant touch of an adult who didn't know what to do with his pain. But she didn't move. She said nothing. Her deep, dark eyes simply saw him without judgment, without pity, only with a stillness that was both unnerving and strangely comforting. The tears on his face began to dry, leaving salty trails on his skin. He saw her faded dress, her worn shoes, and felt a pang of something that wasn't superiority, but a confused sense of injustice. How could this girl, who visibly lacked all the possessions that surrounded him, seem so whole? The contrast between the material wealth of his room and her simplicity was stark. He was drowning in a sea of luxury, yet he was suffocating in sadness. She seemed to have nothing, yet she stood firm. Lena felt the weight of his gaze. She also felt fear creeping up her spine, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. Be invisible, Lena. But the pain in the boy's eyes was a magnet stronger than fear. She knew that if she turned her back now, she would be abandoning not just him, but a part of herself that understood that loneliness. Slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might break the fragile spell uniting them, she knelt down. Her small, quick fingers touched the soft plush of the bear. She picked it up, holding it against her chest for an instant, as if asking the silent toy for courage. Then she took the first step inside the room. The carpet was so plush that her feet sank into it, a luxury she had never imagined. Each step was a transgression, a breaking of all rules. She could hear the sound of her own heart in her ears, a fast, anxious beat. Leo watched her approach, his body tensing again. What would she do? Try to force him to play? Say that everything would be all right? He clutched the picture frame tighter, his only anchor. But Lena didn't approach the bed. She stopped a respectful distance away, in the middle of the room, where the afternoon sunlight created a golden square on the floor. And then she did the most unexpected thing of all. With a silent grace, she sat on the floor, cross-legged. She placed the teddy bear carefully on the rug, exactly in the space between them. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, sharing the same air, the same silence, the same invisible pain that hung in the room. For the first time in 6 months, Leo felt he was not completely alone on his island of sorrow. He looked from the girl's serene face to the bear, and back to her. A sob escaped his lips, but this time it wasn't one of despair, it was of relief, and at that exact instant, an imposing shadow fell across the open doorway. Arthur's tall, austere figure appeared, his face twisted into a mask of shock and disapproval at seeing the housekeeper's daughter sitting on the floor of his heir's bedroom. Arthur's voice cut the air like an ice blade. "What is the meaning of this?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. His commanding presence filled the doorway, the shadow stretching across the floor, swallowing Lena's small figure. She shrank back, the warmth of the moment evaporating and leaving a chill of dread in its place. Her eyes widened, fixed on the hardened face of the man who owned everything around her, including her mother's fate. Leo, on the bed, hugged the picture frame to his chest, a fragile shield against the fury he felt emanating from his father. For the first time, it wasn't sadness that dominated his small body, but a protective instinct toward the silent girl on the floor. Arthur didn't look at the child. His gaze swept the scene with disdain, as if finding a pest in his immaculate garden. "Rosa!" His voice echoed down the hall, sharp and impatient. Hurried, terrified footsteps sounded in the corridor, and soon Lena's mother appeared, her face pale, her eyes filled with panic. Upon seeing the scene, her daughter sitting on the floor of the boss's room, Arthur's furious look, Rosa's heart sank. "Sir, please forgive me. I told her not to move from her spot. Lena, stand up immediately." Her voice was a trembling whisper, laced with fear. She grabbed her daughter's arm, pulling her up with desperate urgency. "This won't happen again, I swear. She won't bother anyone anymore." Arthur ignored the woman's plea, his cold eyes fixed on her. "I don't pay you so that your daughter can disrupt my son. He's going through a delicate period." The word delicate sounded like a euphemism for something he considered a weakness. "I manage complex deals. I make decisions that affect the future of a vast estate, and I expect the rules of my house to be followed. This mixing is highly inappropriate." The contempt in his voice was palpable. He didn't see 2 children. He saw a social barrier that had been violated. "Ensure she stays where she cannot be seen or heard. Preferably, don't bring her back. Your continued employment here depends on your discretion." The veiled threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Rosa nodded repeatedly, unable to form words, only dragging Lena out of the room. The girl, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, looked back one last time. Her gaze met Leo's. In that brief second, a silent promise passed between them, an understanding that no adult there could comprehend. Then the door closed, leaving Leo once again alone in his golden cage. Arthur remained in the corridor for an instant, adjusting his suit jacket, as if trying to restore the order of his perfectly controlled universe. He waited, his body tense, prepared for the inevitable burst of crying that always followed any confrontation. He waited for the first sob, for the escalating lament, for the sound that had become the routine of his days. But the sound didn't come. From the other side of the door, only silence. A deep, thick silence, and, for Arthur, utterly terrifying. He pressed his ear against the cold wood, his breath caught in his throat. Nothing. For the first time in 182 days, his son was not crying. The silence was a living creature in the mansion. Arthur stood frozen outside Leo's room, his hand hovering over the golden doorknob. His mind, accustomed to analyzing data, calculating investment risks, and predicting stock market fluctuations, couldn't process this new variable. The absence of crying was more unsettling than its constant presence. On one hand, it was the relief he had desperately sought. On the other, the cause of this relief was the housekeeper's daughter, an intruder from a world he strove to keep far from his own. A moral dilemma began to form in his mind, as complex as deciding on the allocation of millions in high-risk funds. His prejudices, rooted by a lifetime of privilege, fought against the undeniable evidence that something in that forbidden interaction had calmed his son. Leo's well-being had to be his absolute priority, the greatest of all his assets. But at what cost? Allowing this proximity would be admitting that all his wealth, his possessions, and his status were impotent. It would be an admission of failure. He stepped away from the door, descending the stairs with heavy steps. In the kitchen, Rosa was scrubbing a marble countertop with suppressed fury, silent tears streaming down her face. Lena sat on a stool in the corner, knees together, hands in her lap, small and motionless like a porcelain figurine. The fear of losing the job hung over them like a dark cloud. Arthur stopped at the entrance, and Rosa trembled as she noticed his presence. "Sir," she began, her voice fragile, "I apologize again. I can guarantee—" He interrupted her with an impatient gesture. "Your job, for now, is safe." The words came out harsher than he intended. "But the girl—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He looked at Lena's small, serious face, and, for the first time, didn't just see the daughter of an employee. He saw an inexplicable calm, a silent strength that violently contrasted with the emotional storm consuming his house. What was it about her? What had she done that renowned psychologists and toys worth thousands of dollars could not? That afternoon, the silence persisted. Leo didn't leave his room, but he didn't cry either. Arthur tried to work in his study, surrounded by stock charts and dividend reports, but his concentration was shattered. Every minute of quiet was a reminder of his impotence. The sound of the telephone ringing startled him. It was his mother, Adelaide, the family matriarch, a woman whose rigidity was as legendary as the fortune she had helped build. "Arthur, dear, how is my grandson?" The question was routine but heavy with expectation. "He's quiet today," Arthur replied, the hesitation evident in his voice. "Quiet. Wonderful. Is that new therapist finally taking hold?" Adelaide had never approved of what she called Arthur's indulgence in the boy's grief. To her, pain was a weakness to be overcome quickly. "No, Mother, it wasn't the therapist." He paused, knowing what he was about to say would open Pandora's box. "It was a girl, the new housekeeper's daughter." There was a glacial silence on the other end of the line. "A what? Arthur, have you lost your mind? Mixing our Leo with that kind of people. This is inadmissible. Think of the family reputation, our businesses, a child from the inner city influencing the heir to our legacy. What will people say?" Her voice was a whip, each word a blow to his already shaken confidence. The social pressure, which he had always deftly managed in the business world, was now turning against him in his own home. The threat was clear. Either he restored order, or his competence as a father would be publicly questioned. The conversation with his mother left a bitter taste in Arthur's mouth. Her words, "that kind of people," echoed in his mind, reinforcing the walls he himself had built around his life. The family reputation, the integrity of the estate, the public perception, these were the pillars upon which he had built his empire. Allowing an improbable friendship to shake these structures seemed too high a risk investment. The next day, Adelaide acted with the efficiency of an executive closing a hostile deal. Two men in suits, introduced as the nation's top child psychologists, arrived at the mansion. They looked at Leo not as a grieving child, but as a problem to be solved, a defective asset needing repair so as not to devalue the family brand. They entered Leo's room with leather briefcases and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They spoke of neurotransmitters and prescribed medication, labeling his deep sorrow as a chemical imbalance. Leo shrank back in bed, refusing to speak, the silence that had once been a relief for Arthur now transforming into a barrier of resistance. The boy instinctively sensed the falseness of these men, the lack of genuine connection in their rehearsed questions. They wanted to silence his crying with pills, to erase his pain instead of helping him understand it. Meanwhile, downstairs, Rosa instructed Lena with a severity born of fear. "You will stay in the pantry. Don't leave for anything, do you hear me? If the boss sees you again, we'll be out on the street." The small, windowless room, filled with the scent of cleaning supplies, became Lena's prison. She sat on a wooden crate, her heart heavy. She could hear the psychologists' voices upstairs, their condescending tone, and imagined Leo, alone, facing this new form of solitude. He didn't need doctors. He needed a friend. She knew this with a certainty that came from her own experience with loss. The pressure on Arthur was mounting. Calls from uncles, cousins, and business partners began to arrive. The gossip had spread like wildfire through the elite social circle. The millionaire widower was allowing a poor girl to become his son's confidant. It was seen as a sign of weakness, of emotional instability after his wife's loss. His ability to manage the family's vast capital was being questioned. He felt cornered. The choice seemed clear: remove the girl and placate the family, or risk everything for an uncertain chance at happiness for his son. That night, after the psychologists left, leaving behind a prescription and a technical report on Leo's childhood depression, Arthur went upstairs to see his son. The door was locked from the inside, something Leo had never done before. "Leo, son, open the door." Silence. "Leo, please." From the other side, he heard the unmistakable sound. The crying had returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the sad, continuous lament from before. It was a cry of rage, of frustration, a scream for help from a soul being utterly misunderstood. Arthur felt a sharp pang of panic. His mother's solutions, the solutions of his world, were making everything worse. He was losing his son. In the small, dark pantry, Lena heard it too. The muffled sound of crying reached her, and each sob felt like a stab in her chest. She couldn't stay still any longer. Ignoring her mother's orders, she slowly opened the door. In her small hands, she held a scrap of brown paper bag and a stub of a pencil she always carried in her pocket. With a determination that surpassed her fear, she knew what she had to do. The darkness of the hallway was broken only by a strip of light coming from Arthur's study. Lena moved with the furtiveness of a small, frightened animal, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know exactly what awaited her, only that passive silence was no longer an option. Leo's crying upstairs was a call she could not ignore. With the crumpled note in her hand, she stopped in front of the study door, the solid wood seeming like an insurmountable wall. She took a deep breath. The smell of leather and Cuban cigar smoke leaking through the crack. It was the smell of power, of money, of a world that was not hers. She raised her trembling hand and knocked. a touch so light it was almost lost in the vastness of the house. The door swung open abruptly, revealing Arthur on the phone, his face tense, illuminated by the computer screen displaying cryptocurrency charts. "What is it now?" he snarled, his patience exhausted. Then he saw who it was. His expression hardened, a mix of irritation and surprise. Lena didn't say a word. She simply held out her small hand, offering the piece of paper bag. He stared at her, then at the note, the disdain evident on his face. He probably thought it was a drawing, a childish scribble. He was about to dismiss her when something in her eyes stopped him. There was an urgency there, a seriousness that did not belong to an 8-year-old. With a sigh of impatience, he took the paper. The handwriting was uneven, the letters large and a little shaky, but perfectly legible. He began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Sir," the letter began, "my name is Lena. I know you don't want me near your son. My mother said I could make her lose her job, but I need to tell you something. I hear Leo crying, and I know why he cries. It's not because he's sad. It's because he's afraid of forgetting." Arthur stopped reading, his heart leaping unexpectedly. How could this girl know that? It was a fear he himself felt, but buried under layers of work and responsibilities. He continued reading, the voice on the phone talking about stock returns, becoming a distant hum. "When my dad died, I cried a lot too. My mom cried in secret. People gave gifts and said it would pass, but it doesn't pass. You just learn to keep the missing in a warm place inside your chest. Leo doesn't need medicine. He needs someone who sits next to him and isn't afraid of the silence. He just wants to know he's not alone in his fear of forgetting his mother's smile. I lost my dad too. I understand." Each word was a small blow to his armor. He looked at the girl, who remained standing, her gaze fixed on the floor, awaiting the verdict. The simplicity and depth of those words struck him with the force of a revelation. Expensive therapists, influential relatives, high-tech toys, all had tried to fill Leo's void with things, with solutions, with noise. But this poor girl, with her faded dress and a scrap of paper bag, had diagnosed the wound with surgical precision. He, the billionaire, the master of business, had been so blinded by the need to maintain appearances and control the situation that he had forgotten the most fundamental thing: empathy. He had treated his son's grief as a liability on his balance sheet, something to be eliminated, not as a journey to be shared. His assets, his investments in gold and treasury bonds, his entire net worth in euros and dollars, they were all useless. The phone dropped from his hand, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. For the first time in a long time, Arthur looked at the housekeeper's daughter and didn't see a threat to his status. He saw the only person in the entire world who seemed to truly understand the pain that was destroying his family. Arthur's world, built on the cold logic of numbers, profit and net worth, cracked. The piece of paper bag in his hand felt heavier and more valuable than a gold bar. Every word written by Lena was a mirror reflecting his own failure, not as a billionaire, but as a father. He was so busy managing his property, diversifying his portfolio with stocks, and even venturing into high-risk crypto like Bitcoin, that he had forgotten the most crucial investment of all, his son's heart. He finally understood that Leo's pain wasn't a liability to be eliminated, but a legacy of love that needed to be honored. Lifting his eyes from the paper, he looked at Lena, no longer as the daughter of an employee, but as an emissary of a truth he had lost. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and hoarse with an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time. He extended his hand, not as a boss, but as an ally. Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second and then placed her small hand in his. Together, they turned toward the staircase. The sound of Leo's crying, coming from upstairs, felt like a lighthouse in the fog, guiding them. But before they could take the first step, a terrified figure emerged from the kitchen. Rosa, upon seeing her daughter's hand in the multi-millionaire's, Her face drained of color. Fear, cold and visceral, possessed her. To her, this scene was not one of hope, but of imminent disaster. "Sir, Lena, what have you done?" she hissed, rushing toward them. She grabbed Lena's other arm, trying to pull her away from Arthur. "Forgive me, sir. She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's doing. I told her to stay put. We are leaving now. No need to worry." The torrent of words was driven by the pure panic of someone who knows how fragile their financial security is. Arthur looked at Rosa's desperate face and understood. He, with all his fortune, represented a threat. His kindness was so unusual that it was interpreted as the prelude to a storm. "Rosa, calm down," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "She hasn't done anything wrong. On the contrary, I need her help." The declaration only increased Rosa's panic. Help? What help could a girl like hers offer a man like him? This could only be a cruel test. "No, sir. We don't want trouble. She is my daughter. My responsibility. We are going." She pulled Lena harder, creating a painful tug-of-war with the child in the middle. Lena looked from her mother's terrified face to Arthur's unexpectedly pleading one. Leo's crying upstairs grew louder, more desperate. "Please, Rosa," Arthur said, and the use of her first name, the break in formality, shocked her to the core. "My son needs her." But Rosa's fear was a wall higher than any plea. She saw ruin, humiliation, the return to uncertainty. Protecting her daughter from this dangerous, unpredictable world was her only instinct. With a resolution born of despair, she looked directly into the eyes of Arthur, the man who held all the power, and took the only action she could. She placed herself physically between him and the stairs. "If you take my daughter into that room, we will leave this house today, and we will never come back." Rosa's threat hung in the air, fragile and yet unwavering. Arthur saw in her face not the insolence of an employee, but the terror of a mother protecting her child. He, who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals and moved the stock market with a phone call, found himself at an impasse with a woman whose only wealth was her dignity and love for her daughter. The situation was a microcosm of his own dilemma, the conflict between power and humanity. Upstairs, Leo's crying intensified, as if the boy could feel the tension unfolding below. The sound was a barb in Arthur's heart. He looked at the stairs, at the closed door of his son's room, and then back at the human barrier formed by Rosa and Lena. He realized he couldn't simply use his authority. Forcing the situation would be repeating the same mistake he had made from the start, using power and money to impose solutions instead of building bridges of trust. "Rosa," he began, his voice calm and measured, as if explaining a complex investment strategy. "I understand your fear. I caused it. I treated you like an invisible piece in this house. And I was surprised when your daughter proved to have more wisdom than all my advisors combined." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I am not asking you to risk your job. I am asking for your help, not as my employee, but as a mother who understands loss." He looked at Lena, who observed the exchange with a maturity that haunted him. "Your daughter wrote something for me, something that made me realize how blind I have been." Rosa's face twisted in confusion and fear. A letter. What could Lena have written that would change this man's attitude? Was it a trap? At that exact moment, the sound of Leo's crying abruptly ceased, replaced by a dull thud coming from the room, followed by the sound of something breaking. A cold panic shot through Arthur's veins. "Leo!" he shouted, the veneer of calm crumbling. Paternal instinct overcame any negotiation. He bypassed Rosa, who was paralyzed by the sound, and ran up the stairs, 2 steps at a time. Lena, released from her mother's grip, raced behind him, her small feet barely keeping up. Rosa, left behind, was torn between the fear of following and the terror of staying. What was happening? Arthur wrenched the doorknob of Leo's room, but the door was locked. "Leo, open the door! Son, talk to me!" Silence. only the sound of his own ragged breathing. The fear that gripped him was different from any financial risk he had ever faced. Losing money was recoverable. Losing a son was the end of everything. "Lena, stand back," he ordered, and with a force born of pure desperation, he slammed his shoulder against the door. The wood splintered. On the second attempt, the lock gave way, and the door burst open with a crash. The scene that greeted them was one of desolation. Leo was not physically hurt. He stood in the middle of the room, next to the overturned nightstand. On the floor, amidst shards of glass, lay the picture frame of his mother. The broken glass scratched the smiling image of the woman they both loved. The boy stared at the destroyed photo, his body trembling, his face pale, his eyes wide not with sadness, but with a silent horror. He wasn't crying. He had passed the point of tears. He was in a place of pure, silent devastation. Upon seeing his father in the doorway and Lena right behind him, his lips trembled, and he whispered a single sentence that broke Arthur's heart into 1,000 pieces. "I broke her. Now she's going to disappear forever." Leo's words hung in the air, weighted with a terrifying, childlike logic. To him, the photograph wasn't just an image, it was his mother's very presence, a talisman against forgetting. And now, it was broken. Arthur stood frozen in the doorway, his chest squeezed by a pain so acute it stole his breath. All his assets, his investments in gold and treasury, his entire fortune seemed useless, reduced to nothing before that simple, profound tragedy. He opened his mouth to say something, to fix it, to promise to buy a new frame, the most expensive, the most beautiful. But the words died in his throat. He knew that any material solution would sound like an insult to his son's pain. It was Lena who moved first. With a delicacy that contrasted with the tension in the room, she entered, her bare feet carefully avoiding the shards of glass. She didn't look at Arthur or Leo. Her eyes were fixed on the damaged photo on the floor. She knelt down, the hem of her simple dress brushing the splinters. With intense concentration, she began gathering the largest pieces of glass, pushing them aside with her fingertips, creating a safe path. Leo watched her. His breath caught in small, silent sobs. He looked like an ice statue, ready to shatter. When Lena cleared the space around the photograph, she picked it up with the utmost care, as if holding a wounded bird. She stood up and walked to Leo. She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault" or "It's okay." She simply held up the photograph for him to see. "Look," she said, her voice soft as a whisper. The glass broke, but she didn't. She's still smiling. Leo looked at the image. His mother's face was intact, the smile still shining through the photographic paper. A tiny tear, the first since the accident, rolled down his cheek. Lena then did something even more remarkable. She took Leo's hand and gently used his little fingers to help brush away the last slivers of glass clinging to the frame's edge. "We can fix it," she said, not referring just to the picture frame. "It won't be like before, but she will still be here." At that moment, a trembling voice came from the doorway. "Lena!" It was Rosa, who had finally gathered the courage to climb up. She saw the scene, the glass on the floor, the two children together, and Arthur's stunned look. But the panic on her face was replaced by a wave of another emotion, an immense, painful pride. Her daughter, in her simplicity and compassion, was achieving a miracle no one else could. Arthur finally moved. He entered the room, kneeling beside the two children, becoming part of the small circle of healing. He looked at the photo in Lena's hands, and for the first time since his wife's funeral, allowed himself to feel the fullness of his own pain, not as a weakness to be hidden, but as a testament to his love. "She's right, son," he said, his voice choked. "We can fix it, together." And then a sound interrupted the tender moment. The insistent, authoritative ring of the front doorbell. Alfred, the butler, appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. "Sir, it's your mother, and she's not alone. Your uncles and cousins are with her. It looks like an intervention." The word intervention dropped like a stone into the room's fragile silence. Arthur felt a wave of cold rush down his spine. His family. Now, the gear of the social machine he so valued was moving against him, coming to reclaim the control they judged he had lost. He stood up, the moment of connection with Leo dissipating like smoke. His initial instinct was the usual: protect the image, manage the crisis, present a facade of order. He looked at Rosa and Lena, and the harsh reality hit him. Their presence here was the fuse for this visit. They were the proof, in his family's eyes, of his supposed insanity. "Rosa, take Lena to the kitchen, quickly, and please." "Stay there," he said, his voice tense, returning to his commanding tone. He wasn't banishing them out of shame, but out of a protective instinct. He knew the cruelty his mother was capable of when she felt the family's status was threatened. Rosa nodded, fear returning to her eyes. She took Lena's hand, who looked at Leo with reluctance, as if fearing that by leaving, the magic would break. Leo grabbed the hem of her dress, a silent gesture of plea. "Dad," he whispered, his voice filled with a new anxiety. Arthur knelt in front of him. "Son, I need you to stay here in the room for a bit. It's going to be fine. I promise." He took the broken photo from Lena's hands and carefully placed it on Leo's bed. "We will fix this later." He kissed his son's forehead and stood up, his face transforming into the impassive mask he wore for the most difficult board meetings. He descended the stairs, each step a pace toward a battlefield. In the entrance hall, his family was gathered, Adelaide, his mother, in the center, regal and glacial, his uncles, men whose opinions held sway on his corporate boards, and his cousins, who saw Leo's inheritance as part of their own financial future. They looked at him not with concern, but with the appraising gaze of creditors about to call in a debt. "Arthur," Adelaide began, her voice cutting, "enough of this madness. We were informed that you dismissed the psychologists and continue to allow unsuitable people to influence your son." His uncle Robert, a man whose fortune was built on ruthless deals, stepped forward. "Arthur, this isn't just about Leo. It's about the stability of our portfolio. Rumors are circulating. They say you are emotionally unstable. This affects investor confidence, the value of our stocks. You are risking decades of work for a sentimental whim." It was a coordinated attack, a corporate maneuver to retake control of an asset they deemed mismanaged, him and his son. They spoke of Leo not as a grieving boy, but as a future CEO receiving inadequate training. The presence of Lena and Rosa, even hidden, was the symptom of a disease they wanted to eradicate. "What do you intend to do?" Adelaide asked, the final question of an ultimatum. "Will you listen to us? Act like a man of our position? Or will you continue with this sentimental farce and force us to take more drastic measures to protect the family's interests?" The choice was laid before him, clear and brutal. It was his legacy, his businesses, his position in the world against his son's fragile, newfound happiness. The future of his vast financial empire depended on his answer, and he knew, with devastating clarity, that any path he chose would lead to an irreparable loss. The air in the living room grew heavy, dense with the weight of unspoken expectations and veiled threats. Arthur looked at every face present, faces he had known since childhood, linked to him by blood and by balance sheets. He saw the greed in the cousin's eyes, the calculating concern of the uncles, and the icy determination of his mother. They weren't there to save him. They were there to save themselves. To protect the cash flow, the dividends, the inheritance. He was the CEO of their own lives, and they were convening an emergency board meeting to remove him from the position. For an instant, the old Arthur, the master of the financial universe, almost took control. He could placate them with promises, present an action plan, ensure the public image remained spotless. He could fire Rosa, banish Lena, hire a new team of therapists, and suffocate Leo's pain under a blanket of forced normalcy. It would be the smart play, the most logical business decision. It would maintain his status, his wealth, and the peace or absence of war in his family. But then, an image invaded his mind. Leo's face, pale with horror, looking at the broken photo, and Lena's soft voice saying, "The glass broke," but she didn't. In that moment, he understood something fundamental about value. His whole life had been dedicated to accumulating assets, to increasing his net worth. But what was the true value of his son's smile? What was the return on investment for empathy? These were currencies that couldn't be traded on the stock exchange, but which, he now realized, were the only ones that truly mattered. He took a deep breath. Not the sigh of a defeated man, but of a man who had finally found his center. He looked directly at his mother. "I appreciate everyone's concern for the businesses," he began, his voice calm, but with a new timbre of unshakable authority. "But you seem to be confusing my home with a boardroom and my son with a product line." A murmur of shock rippled through the group. Adelaide glared at him. "Don't be insolent, Arthur." "Insolent," he countered, a sad smile touching his lips. "No, Mother. For the first time in a long time, I am being honest. I almost lost my son. Not to an illness, but to silence, to loneliness, to the idea that his pain was an inconvenience that needed to be managed." He gestured, encompassing the luxurious room. "All of this," he said, "all this wealth, couldn't do what an 8-year-old girl, with nothing but a compassionate heart, did in 5 minutes. She didn't try to fix him. She just sat with him in his pain." "This is ridiculous sentimentality," spat Uncle Robert. "We are talking about an empire." "No," Arthur corrected. "You are talking about an empire. I am talking about my son, and the decision has already been made." He walked toward the hallway, his spine straight. "Rosa, Lena, please come here." The panic on his family's faces was palpable. Rosa and Lena appeared at the entrance to the room, shrinking back, like 2 deer before a pack of wolves. Arthur went to them and, to the horror of all present, placed a protective hand on Rosa's shoulder and another on Lena's head. He turned to face his family, his clan, his business partners. "This is my family now," he declared, his voice resounding with absolute finality. "A family that cares about what is broken on the inside, not what looks perfect on the outside. For those who cannot accept this, the door is open, and I suggest you use it." The silence that followed was deafening, the moment of truth, the point of no return. His choice would separate him forever from his past, his blood, his world. And in the middle of that unbearable tension, a soft sound came from the staircase. Leo was there at the top of the steps, holding the broken photo against his chest. And Sedichin, for the first time in 6 months, he wasn't crying, he was smiling. Leo's smile was the final sentence. For Arthur, it was the confirmation that he had made the most profitable investment of his life. For his family, it was irrefutable proof that they had lost him to a world of emotions they could neither quantify nor control. Adelaide looked at her grandson, then at the scene in the hall. Arthur, standing next to the housekeeper and her daughter, like a king declaring his new court. Her face was a mask of fury and disappointment. She didn't say a word. She simply turned with a glacial dignity and walked toward the door that Alfred the butler held open, his face impassive as ever. One by one, the uncles and cousins followed her, giving Arthur looks that were a mixture of contempt and pity. They saw him as a man who had traded a kingdom for a hovel, a billionaire who had declared emotional bankruptcy. The heavy door closed behind them, and the sound echoed through the mansion, not like an end, but like a beginning. The silence that settled was not the heavy silence of grief or tension. It was a clean, spacious silence, full of possibilities. Arthur exhaled the breath he didn't realize he was holding. He looked at Rosa, whose face was bathed in silent tears of shock and relief. He looked at Lena, who gave him a small, shy smile of approval. And then he looked up at Leo, who slowly descended the stairs, the smile still on his lips. "Dad," he said, his voice clear, "can we fix it now?" He held up the photo. Arthur felt his own tears welling up. "Yes, son, we can fix everything now." He knelt down and opened his arms, and Leo ran to him, hugging him with a force he hadn't had in months. It was a hug that sealed the rift between them, a hug that rebuilt the bridge that grief had broken. In the days that followed, the mansion began to transform. Arthur formally invited Rosa and Lena to move into one of the house's guest wings, not as employees, but as part of the family. Rosa, initially hesitant, eventually accepted, realizing that her daughter's security and happiness were worth more than her pride or fear. For the first time, the impeccable garden heard the sound of children's laughter. Leo and Lena ran across the grass, inventing imaginary worlds among the rose bushes, their voices filling the void that had once echoed with weeping. Arthur's first victory came quickly. Leo was a child again. He still had moments of sadness, days when the longing for his mother tightened its grip. But now he wasn't alone. He had Lena to sit with him in silence, and he had a father who had learned to listen with his heart instead of his checkbook. Arthur discovered that the real cash flow that mattered was that of affection. He began working less, delegating the management of part of his fortune, being present for breakfast and bedtime stories. He and Rosa developed a friendship based on mutual respect and a common goal: to give their children the childhood they deserved. They talked in the kitchen, sharing stories of their deceased spouses, finding solace in shared pain. The second victory was mutual healing. Leo, with his sensitivity, helped Lena open up, to talk about the father she barely knew, but whose absence had shaped her life. And Lena, with her quiet strength, taught Leo that resilience didn't mean forgetting, but carrying love forward. Together, they fixed the picture frame with glue and tape. It wasn't perfect. The cracks in the glass were still visible, but they decided to leave them that way, as a reminder that things can be broken and still be beautiful and whole. It was a symbol of their new family. Imperfect, improbable, but undeniably real. 6 weeks after that first silent meeting in Leo's room, the mansion was unrecognizable, not in its structure, which remained opulent and grand, but in its soul. Where once a funereal silence reigned, life now pulsed. The smell of waxed furniture mixed with that of freshly baked cookies by Rosa, and the muffled sound of sobs had been replaced by the echo of 2 children running through the corridors, their laughter the melody that had healed the wounds of that house. Arthur sat on the back porch, watching Leo and Lena in the garden. They had built a fort with old sheets and branches and were now staging a grand adventure. Seeing his son covered in dirt with a genuine smile on his face was a greater profit than any dividend his stocks had ever yielded. He had learned that true wealth was not stored in vaults or invested in Bitcoin. It was in those fleeting moments of pure joy. The loss of his extended family had been painful, a social liability he had to accept. But the gain in his personal life was incalculable. He had traded a business inheritance for a legacy of love. One day, while Arthur reviewed some papers in his study, now a less obsessive and more balanced habit, his lawyers informed him of the final procedures for a process he had begun weeks earlier. It was something he had decided upon a night of deep reflection, a choice that would solidify the new structure of his family. He called Rosa to the living room. She entered, hesitant as always, despite her new position in the house. "Rosa," he began, his voice calm and serious, "since you and Lena arrived, this house has become a home again. You have given us more than we could have imagined." He paused, searching for the right words. "I know I can't replace the father Lena lost, just as no one can replace Leo's mother. But a family is not just made of blood. It is made of choice, of care, of love. He handed her a leather folder. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside were the adoption papers. Arthur was asking to legally become Lena's father. The tears Rosa shed were not of fear or sadness, but of a gratitude so overwhelming it left her speechless. She looked at this man, the multi-millionaire she had feared so much, and saw only a father wanting to give her daughter the security and future that she, with her humble job, could never guarantee. She nodded, a gesture worth more than 1,000 words. The final victory was neither financial nor social, but profoundly human. Lena's adoption created a family united not by convenience or lineage, but by the conscious choice to heal together. 3 people broken by loss from completely different worlds had found each other in the wreckage of their lives and built something new, strong and authentic. The story ended there, in that sunny garden. The boy who couldn't stop crying discovered that the cure for the deepest pain sometimes comes from those who understand our silence. The poor girl who dared to cross an invisible barrier proved that empathy is the most valuable asset in the world. The father, who almost lost everything trying to control the uncontrollable, learned that the greatest profitability comes from surrendering to love. And the mother, who feared the power of the wealthy, discovered that her daughter's courage was the greatest fortune she could possess. The mansion that was once a tomb of luxury was now a vibrant home, proving that from the deepest grief, the most beautiful and improbable of families can be born.